Greetings everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of the Risk 4.0 video blog series. In this particular episode, we aim to discuss the coronavirus phenomenon due to it being the ultimate modern day case study in risk resilience and complex systems. Now, for those of you who've been following us in our earlier episodes, you will know we have been exploring a very particular theme. That is, we now live in a modern working world that is defined by two very specific characteristics. The first is the concept of absolute global connectivity. For the first time in human history, we're now living in a working world that is fully integrated and codependent. The second is the concept of perpetual disruption. And again, for the first time in human history, we're living in a time where emerging technologies, continually shifting stakeholder relationships and trends are ensuring that things are changing over and over again and in quicker time than ever before. So what we now have learned is that the global risk management community is now faced with a very particular challenge, and that's how to effectively control high impact risks born from a highly interconnected world experiencing ever increasing frequencies of change. Now, running with this theme, I've been talking for years now about the emergence of a new generation of threats, macro global threats. Those threats that are impacting us as a collective community, those threats that we can only resolve by coming together and collaborating as a collective community. Now, during 2020, we saw one of these threats escalate to the level that it was undeniable and we had no choice but to face up it. And that, of course, was the COVID-19 phenomenon. The thing about COVID-19 was that it was our first genuine operational readiness test for controlling this new generation of macro global threats. How we planned for and responded to the coronavirus is actually critically indicative of how we will inevitably plan for and respond to future macro global threats. Now, if we keep this in mind, this month sees the 12-month anniversary of the coronavirus threat, so it's probably a good time to do a review. I realize that this is an incredibly emotive and divisive topic, and the more you talk about it, the more likely you are to trip over someone's personal sensitivity threshold. But considering that the coronavirus phenomena has impacted us all at a personal, societal, and even at a species level, I believe it's not only our right to discuss how we plan for and responded to the coronavirus, but it's actually our duty. Now, I don't claim to understand the pressures and hardships experienced by those in the front line of the pandemic. All I aim to do is look at the threat from a macro global level for the purposes of discussing how we improve our natural resilience to such threat. I also believe it is important that we all acknowledge that none of the negative threats which our global society has experienced so far were actually caused by the virus itself, but rather these negative impacts were caused by how we as a society collectively planned for and responded to the pandemic. That is, much of the negative impacts that we are feeling right now are actually self-inflicted. And when you come to accept that concept, then you'll understand why it is so important that we talk about the pandemic, particularly the decisions we made and the manner in which we responded to the pandemic. So after 12 months, we're probably in a position to do a review of some of the countries out there and how they actually responded to the virus, and potentially how we responded collectively at a macro level too. If we look at the screen, we should see 4 famous cases. There's Australia. Now, their total death after 12 months was 35 deaths per million. They had a relatively insignificant first wave. They managed to control it fairly well, but then they dropped a couple of balls and they had a more catastrophic second wave. Sweden, another famous case, they had quite a noticeable first wave, but they managed to pull it back, and around about August they were one of the lowest new fatality rates in the world. They then had another second wave which was probably more moderate than the first wave, and in the end their total fatality rate's about 800 deaths per million. The USA, that's probably been one of the most famous case studies. It doesn't look like they ever really had a remission period, but then again they've got 50 states to deal with. They had a first wave, a second wave, and now it looks like they're having an even more catastrophic third wave. And then of course there is Belgium, probably the most unluckiest of the countries. Belgium did all the right things. They locked down, they social distance, they enforced it quite hard, but in the end they've had 2 fatalistic waves, and they're sitting at a death rate of roughly 1,600 deaths per million people. Now, I think the key learning here is that every country experienced a different COVID fatality rates and a different COVID experience, if you will. But if we assume that there is a general common profile amongst these countries, this is what I'd like to explore a little bit. So what that 12-month profile generally looks like is that there was a pre-COVID period, and then all of a sudden there was a first wave in roughly March. For most countries, they managed to flatten that out. They then had a remission period where their cases went really, really low. And then many countries, if not most countries, then experienced roughly in the fourth quarter a second wave, which then begs questions around what the future might look like. So I want to break this 12-month period down and just analyze each of these areas, particularly around some of the decisions we made and some of the tactical responses we put in place. And I think the first one of interest is probably the pre-COVID period. How did we proactively prepare for COVID-19? Now, from the very beginning of the pandemic, some people were referring to this as being an unforeseeable black swan event, but this simply wasn't true. The fact is we had repeated warnings and near misses indicating that a global pandemic was inevitable at some point. And I'd like to show you some of the data that's out there supporting this. So there are actually a number of websites out there which show us the history of pandemics. This is one of the cooler ones that I kind of liked, and what it shows you is a history timeline of pandemics. So you see pandemics have been around ever since the beginning of time. They're actually part of human evolution. You'll see the first genuine mass global pandemic, or mass pandemic at least, was the Black Death that killed about 200 million people. Then we saw smallpox in about the 1500s. We saw cholera, we saw yellow fever, and more recently we've seen HIV and AIDS. Now, where it gets really, really interesting is in the last 20 years when our world shifted to that interconnected, complex, systemic existence. And what we've seen is that major pandemics have actually increased quite noticeably. And over the last 20 years, we've had quite a few all of a sudden pop up. MERS, SARS, Ebola, swine flu, and most recently COVID-19. And if you put them back to back, what you'll see is that COVID-19 is actually not the most fatalistic so far, but it's definitely up there. It's sitting around about 9th. But there are a lot of other pandemics which have done worse off on it. And you can argue it any way you want, but the reality is where it stands right now. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence demonstrating that we should have known that a pandemic was coming and we should have been better prepared for it comes from the 2019 World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. So as most of you will know, the world's leaders get together in Davos, Switzerland, roughly January, February every year to talk a bit about the big macro trends and threats that are facing the world. And at that forum, the World Economic Forum presents their annual risk report, looking at all the big macro issues. And this here is a copy of the 2019 version. You can download it off the internet for yourself. It is freely available. And if we actually just scroll down to the opening paragraph, I'm just going to find it here quickly. There it is. I'll make it a little bit bigger so we can see it. The opening sentence of the 2019 Global Risk Report says, "Is the world sleepwalking into a global crisis?" Global risks are intensifying, but the collective will to tackle them appears to be lacking. Instead, divisions are hardening. And what they were actually saying at the time was that the world was too focused on divisive topics such as Trump politics, Brexit deals, and Chinese and other global trade war. And what we weren't doing was putting our head down and focusing on the things that really mattered, particularly global macro threats. And they put a whole bunch on the table for us to review. So the World Economic Forum warned the world's leaders in January, February 2019 that there were certain classes of risk that we had to start collaborating on and dealing with. And they put a whole bunch on the table, from climate change to global water shortages to increased poverty. And then at number 10, we can see rapid and massive spread of infectious diseases. So we were warned. We were told that this was coming. And equally, when you see the emergence of numerous new viruses over the last 20 years, we knew this was coming. So there was no excuse for being this unprepared. So I think the first learning that we probably get out of our COVID experience to date is that lesson one is that we cannot wait for known macro threats to escalate into crisis. We need to proactively plan for and monitor them. And it's not just pandemics. Like I said, it's climate change, it's growing water shortages, it's growing poverty, all these other things. We know they happen. We know they're inevitable. We can't wait for them to escalate into crisis before we react to them. And unfortunately, that seems to be what we did when it came to coronavirus. We only mobilized when the threat actually escalated into crisis. And if anybody doubts this concept, let me put it to you another way. No elective government would ever have pre-approved a national pandemic response plan that included shutting down the nation's financial ecosystems and placing its voting citizens under house arrest. Yet that is exactly what we did in March when we saw the coronavirus cases escalate. The fact that this is what we actually did is indicative of a crisis-driven lack of preparation. We had to lock down in March because we had no other choice. We'd left our responses far too late, and now we had nothing else ready to go. So inevitably what ended up happening is we saw a first wave rise. It took off. Roughly a third of the world's countries locked down immediately, with numerous others that followed, and we saw about a third of the world's population get placed under enforced lockdown, and in many cases it was actually house arrest. That's what ended up happening. And the reason we needed to do this is we needed to flatten the curve. Our systems weren't ready for this. Our hospitals weren't ready. Our case tracing, our immunity, there just was no preparation ready for this, so we had no choice but to lock down, and that is inevitably what we ended up doing. So after that lockdown period, what we actually learned was something very interesting. We saw our unemployment rate go through the roof. We saw our national earnings go through the floor. And we saw stock markets take record hits. And what we actually now realized was that the first lockdown was teaching us that not only are we vulnerable to the pandemic threat itself, but we are also vulnerable to our chosen control. In other words, mass-scale hard lockdown were hurting us. And what we saw was that this response was not equitable. It was not proportional. It was actually hurting certain demographics much harder. Small businesses, for example, were almost obliterated in some areas. People with casual labor or some of the lower social economic groups were much harder hit than the high economic groups. So what we actually learned was that our society was vulnerable to the very control that we had put in place to manage the threat. Now, we had never ever seen something like this before, and this was an interesting learning. So we found ourselves in a very unique position roughly May, June 2020. Not only had mass-scale hard lockdowns not eradicated the virus, but they had created numerous other potentially catastrophic global threats which now needed to be dealt with in parallel. And what we were learning here was that the control solution that we had chosen for COVID, mass-scale hard lockdown, actually wasn't sustainable. It wasn't equitable, and it wasn't proportional, and in fact it was incredibly damaging. So we now needed to start talking roughly May, June about a recovery plan, something that would get us out of this hole that we found ourselves in and uplift us to a more resilient state. And this is what I'm aim to talk about in episode 2. So if you enjoyed this episode, look out for the second episode, because in the second episode we're going to talk about the road to recovery and some of the decisions that we made which shaped our recovery strategy. And we'll talk about it in the light of resilience, and we'll ask the fundamental question: has our decisions actually made us any more resilient to pandemics than we were potentially 12 months ago? So look out for that episode, and I hope you enjoyed this particular one. Thank you.